Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to get started. Thank you all for attending. This is our second in our exciting new series co-hosted by the Institute of Global Understanding and the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University. Our Global Ocean Governance series is meant to address cutting-edge issues that are of relevance to the marine environment across many subtopics. And our kickoff lecture involved marine geoengineering strategies, featuring Dr. Will Burns. And we're very excited to have today's lecture on high seas biodiversity treaty protections, and have a team of two on our panel today, so to speak, to get a nice balanced perspective on this very important cutting edge issue in ocean governance. I do want to make you aware that we have a series page on our, actually it's on the Urban Coast Institute website, and Aaliyah, if you can put that into the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, I can send it afterwards. So we're going to be posting slides, recordings, and any relevant articles there as well for future reference. And it's just really exciting to be able to take advantage of the pandemic and engage a global audience on a global issue like we have with marine governance, and how important it is on so many levels in 2020. So today's lecture had more than 70 registered attendees from 14 countries. So this is not the sort of thing I've been able to do in Monmouth County if this had been a live session. So I'm grateful for that much, trying to count the blessings in the midst of the pandemic. So having said that, I want to quickly turn it over to Tony Mcdonald, the director of the Urban Coast Institute, so he can give some welcoming remarks before we get started.
Great, thank you very much, Randy, and I'm incredibly excited about this presentation today. It really is a long time coming to be really moving toward the direction that Cymie and Guillermo will explain to us. And what's particularly exciting to me as a lawyer who has some background in international issues is really the incredible, powerful interaction of science and the emerging science that can tell us so much more than it could even 10 years ago. And inform legal and governance mechanisms. So I really think this is a fantastic panel that tees up these issues in a way that I think is really timely and really opportunistic. It's the UN Decade for Ocean Science. I am just recently been appointed to the US National Committee for the decade. I think there are a lot of international opportunities ahead, particularly for biodiversity, and an opportunity for us. So if we learn more today and maybe take some action moving forward after this. So welcome, Cymie and Guillermo. Very much look forward to the presentation today.
Thank you, Tony. So we are, just a few housekeeping reminders. We are recording this lecture, and we are going to have Q&A. It is an hour time frame, so we're hoping to have about 20 minutes for Q&A. And please put your questions into the chat, and I'll be presenting those questions as time permits to our two speakers. So without further ado, very excited to hear from Cymie and Guillermo.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for the introduction, Tony and Randy. I think you all can find our bios on the website and maybe have looked at them already. So I'll just say briefly that I'm at Rutgers University, and so just down the road from Monmouth. And Guillermo is at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, currently having recently finished his PhD at Duke. And Guillermo and I met at the United Nations, where we've both been working on this agreement. So we'll talk to you about the Prospective Global Treaty for Biodiversity in the High Seas and its particular value to coastal and island nations. The United States is a preeminent maritime power, and it's a coastal state. We're speaking to you 2 days after Americans voted, and we don't yet know the results, but whatever the result, as we'll explain, America's interests in a strong new high seas biodiversity treaty remain compelling. The marine area beyond the 12-mile territorial sea, beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and the seabed beyond the extended continental shelf where it exists are the subject of this treaty, nicknamed BBNJ for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Now that's flyover country for those of us who used to take airplanes to Europe or Asia. It's an almost imaginary zone for many of us, for most of us. It doesn't allow easy access, despite the beautiful, rich, complex life forms that inhabit it, life forms that are also essential for our own existence. So why should the United States and other coastal and island nations care about ecosystems that are so far away, even if they are pretty? So Guillermo is going to help answer that question by showing us the connected, dynamic relationship between coastal waters and the high seas. Remember, the United States is a maritime nation. Our coastal waters represent more than half the area the US has jurisdiction over. Our US land is about 3.8 million square miles, and US waters are 4.3 million square miles, partly because of islands like Hawaii that have a great sea area. The US hasn't finished mapping its extended continental shelf, which is probably more than 1.5 times the size of Texas. So yet more to be added, possibly. US fisheries are another lens that we might look at the ocean through. Both coastal and distant water fisheries provide over 700,000 jobs and $53 billion in sales in recent year. Almost half of us get our protein from the sea, most of it or some. And the US is one of the top 10 distant water fishing fleets, that is, US registered vessels that fish on the high seas, a fishery notably that is subsidized quite heavily. About half the value of that fishery appears to come from government subsidies. The US exercises flag state control over ships that are registered to the US and that pursue activities in the high seas. So we extend our national legal jurisdiction through that means. And that includes fishing, shipping, marine scientific research, and other activities. If we look at the news, we see that currently a distant water fishing fleet is sitting in the high seas at its boundary with the Galapagos Marine Reserve, vacuuming up fish that don't have the common sense to stay on the protected side of that artificial border. We're already seeing that when fish populations move because climate change is causing ocean waters to warm, work that my colleague at Rutgers, Malin Pinsky, has been demonstrating, the customary legal rules, bilateral agreements, international court judgments are thrown into disarray. So maritime nations working at the United Nations over the last decade recognized that the world ocean is experiencing an unprecedented loss of marine biodiversity. An ad hoc working group established at the UN reported in 2014 that the increased extent and scope of human activity in the ocean is leading to increased damage to biodiversity, to damage to ecosystem processes and ecosystem functions, sometimes permanently altering the marine environment. They found that the specific sources of the problem are damaging resource extraction, habitat destruction, pollution, ocean acidification, and climate change. And that overfishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, and destructive fishing practices is the greatest threat to marine life forms. Some countries that participated in this UN process actually found that this kind of abuse threatens the survival of mankind, given that the healthy functioning of those diverse systems sustain life on Earth. As a result, a negotiation process was launched to address the closely interrelated problems of ocean space through an integrated, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral approach as the third implementing agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention. The final negotiating session was supposed to take place in March, but it was postponed, not surprisingly to any of us here, indefinitely due to COVID-19. Nonetheless, discussions are continuing in both multilateral and bilateral forms. The full title of the agreement tells you what its goal is. It is to be an internationally, legally binding instrument under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. That's the whole title, very UN of them. You could think of it as, that's what I often call it, slightly inaccurately, a high seas biodiversity treaty, but less of a mouthful. You can think of this as addressing the area beyond national jurisdiction as addressing areas that are more than 200 miles from any coast. And it takes up about half the surface of Earth. As you may imagine, it's necessary for a diverse coalition of nations to join such a treaty for it to be successful. Countries with large ocean-going fleets need to join. Small countries that operate as flags of convenience should join. And island nations that depend on the sea have important interests in participating that need to be recognized. Accordingly, a package of 4 elements was agreed. One is environmental impact assessment to identify activities that could potentially harm marine biodiversity before anything occurs. A second is area-based management tools, which include marine protected areas, but also others, that are intended to restrict harmful activities in particularly valuable or sensitive parts of the ocean. Governance of bioprospecting for marine genetic resources to ensure that access and benefits are equitably shared with humanity is another element. And capacity building and technology transfer to ensure that all states can participate fully is the fourth. So having recognized the need for a legally binding agreement to provide an integrated approach to managing activities that can harm high seas biodiversity, the current state of negotiations is somewhere, I'd say, between real commitment and reluctance to acknowledge that we no longer live in the time of Grotius. International law scholars will remember that Grotius declared the freedoms of the seas and that freedom of navigation, fishing, cable and pipe laying are all codified in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Of course, in the 17th century, there were only about 500 million people on the planet. And so maybe Grotius can be forgiven for his error in claiming that the sea is boundless. We know better, and numerous international agreements between nations have recognized that the oceans is a commons. It's a place where we have to constrain and coordinate our activities. We need now to understand better how jurisdictional zones in the ocean are ecologically connected. What do the high seas have to do with coastal waters? Why should coastal states and island states care about this agreement? And for that, we're going to turn to Guillermo, who will explain.
Thank you very much, Cymie. I'm gonna share my screen. I have some slides for today. So thank you very much for hosting us today, Monmouth University and the Urban Coastal Institute. As Cymie said, my name is Guillermo Ortuño Crespo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and I am an ecologist by training. During my PhD, I spent a lot of time thinking about human activities in the high seas, as well as transboundary connectivity of species between the high seas and coastal ecosystems. So over the next 15 or so minutes, I'm going to try to provide a concise crash course on transboundary connectivity, biodiversity in the high seas, and the risk that many of these species are facing in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and why coastal states such as the United States should care quite a lot about what happens beyond the 200 nautical mile boundary. So this map is just a representation of that very abstract concept that Cymie was describing to us, the high seas, this area where Hugo Grotius' principle still lives today, where there are freedoms to fish and navigate, but the amount of pressure that we have placed, ecologically speaking, on this other half of our planet far exceeds the ability of these ecosystems to assimilate that stress. And now we're seeing that a lot of the populations that inhabit these distant waters are facing very sort of threatening ecological population levels. And if the open ocean was disconnected from the coastal ocean, disconnected from our lives and our economies on our coastal ecosystems, perhaps that wouldn't be a reason for concern. But as I will hopefully show you today and convince you today of, is that the high seas are highly connected to our coastal communities and our coastal systems. I thought it would be appropriate to start trying to describe what biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction looks like, or at least our current understanding, the best scientific knowledge on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And to explain what we currently know, I'm going to lean on OBIS, which is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System. It is a repository of biodiversity information housed at the United Nations. And according to OBIS, we have records of at least 23,000 species which inhabit waters beyond national jurisdiction. Most of them are invertebrates, species which are quite sedentary and demersal, but many of them, including fish, seabirds, marine mammals, and sea turtles, most of those species engage in transboundary movements or annual migrations. And so they connect spawning and feeding grounds in the coastal ocean to other national waters and the high seas. To illustrate what our current understanding of biodiversity in the high seas looks like and why coastal communities should care, I'm going to select Pisces, so the 4,000 or so species that we know inhabit the high seas. And this map that you see on the screen is a spatial representation of where those records are, where the best available information for fish biodiversity in the high seas, where it currently lies. And you will notice that we don't have meaningful biodiversity information for fish in most of the ocean. Every pixel in the screen that you see is a 1 degree cell, which is 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers, where if it's white, we have no records. And if it's light or dark blue, we have anywhere between 1 and 10 biodiversity records. So as we move forward with this treaty, it's important to acknowledge that many parts of the ocean, we still don't know what biodiversity lies there. And maybe we should embrace a precautionary approach towards human uses of those spaces. But again, you might be wondering why should I care about the about the high seas, sorry. And this is where this concept of ecological connectivity comes into play. And it really shows us over the last 30 years or so, we've learned a lot about how the ocean is connected, how some distant ecosystem thousands of miles away may share the same species as our coastal ecosystems back home. For those of you who don't have an ecological background, I will say that there are two types of ecological connectivity. On the left-hand side, we have planktonic or passive connectivity, which is driven by ocean currents primarily, by the oceanography of the ocean. And the small organisms don't have the locomotion power to essentially swim wherever they want. They can control their vertical position, but they are redistributed with the currents. And that's how a lot of the larvae of corals redistribute and settle. The other type of connectivity that I will be spending the rest of the presentation on is known as nectonic or active connectivity. And that is where the animals via locomotion decide their horizontal and vertical position in the water column. And many of these species, such as fish and sharks, as well as seabirds or marine mammals, engage in huge migrations across entire ocean basins in search for food or breeding grounds. In the figure on the right, and I will get back to it a little bit later, you can see the tracks, so essentially GPS tracks from 23 species which were tagged about a decade ago. And you can just see how connected the west coast of the United States, the Hawaiian archipelago, American Samoa, how connected they are to the high seas and to other coastal and island nations. From a legal perspective, we classify these highly mobile species as either highly migratory, as described in the Law of the Sea Convention, or later on as straddling stocks via the Fish Stocks Agreement. And so many of these species engage in all sorts of transboundary movements. They may be able to move between just two exclusive economic zones, between one exclusive economic zone and the high seas, across multiple exclusive economic zones. And depending on how they move across these jurisdictional boundaries, we call them straddling or migratory or highly migratory. But for the purpose of today's talk, I don't think it really matters as long as the species use both coastal ocean and the high seas. Unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that these transboundary species or migratory species are much harder to manage than fish stocks or biodiversity, which is in our coastal ocean exclusively. The more nations and parties you engage with or you have to reach consensus with, the harder it is to set quotas or regional fisheries closures. And according to the FAO, migratory and straddling fish stocks are experiencing overfishing rates that are double that of stocks that are found in national waters. Another challenge that we face, the figure on the right, is the list of highly migratory species listed in the Law of the Sea Convention. And even though it does a fairly good job at listing the main bony fishes and sharks and marine mammals that are migratory, you might notice that no seabirds and no marine sea turtles are mentioned. And in fact, I do think that the Law of the Sea Convention needs to update this list from the 80s. We now know a lot more about highly migratory species in the ocean, and those species also need conservation and management strategies. And part of the reason I say this is because if we look at these, the main three groups of migratory vertebrate species, or sea turtles, seabirds, migratory elasmobranchs, and fish, I am missing marine mammals in this figure, to be fair, but many of them are facing extinction. Others, in the case of sharks, about a third of the species of migratory shark are dated deficient, and about half of the species are threatened. And we are not doing a good job at managing them across jurisdictional boundaries. If humans hadn't expanded into the open ocean, if we were back in the 1700s, maybe this wouldn't matter as much. But the reality is that human capture fisheries, marine capture fisheries, have expanded, as you see in this animation, from the 50s, especially in the 60s and 70s, with the booming of the sushi and the sashimi industry across all latitudinal bands in the ocean. And those affecting sharks and tunas are primarily present in the tropical and temperate latitudes. And essentially, there is no place for these species to hide. And it is absolutely legal for a nation to sit outside of someone else's exclusive economic zone and pick sharks or tunas as they migrate back into our national waters. So I think it's absolutely important and paramount that coastal and island nations do engage in international processes for the conservation of these species if they care about the health of their national coastal ecosystems. Over the years, the UN has established, the global community have established a series of instruments to manage marine capture fisheries in the open ocean. The figure on the left represents the 5 tuna regional fisheries management organizations, which are the main vehicle for establishing quotas of these species in the open ocean, determining what species are at risk of overexploitation and so on. But from my perspective, and there is a fair amount of literature supporting this perspective, these organizations have not done a sufficiently good enough job at protecting non-target species and biodiversity. So the sea turtles, the seabirds, the marine mammals, and the non-target fish that are important for coastal ecosystems in the US and elsewhere from my perspective, are not currently being protected sufficiently well by these bodies. And as an example of that, the figure on the right shows the extent to which these organizations have established spatial closures to fisheries in the high seas. So those light and dark blue polygons represent all the closures that currently exist. Most of them, in fact, all of them are focused on target species. So none of them are intended to reduce the bycatch of marine mammals, for instance. They are quite informal and voluntary, poorly enforced, and quite static. And if there's something we know about the high seas, it's that it is the least static ecosystem on the planet. And yet we're using static rectangles and squares to reduce unintended catch. So again, why should the United States care about the high seas? Essentially, because it is extremely connected, primarily because the United States has the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world. So whatever happens in the high seas is likely to impact one of these territories and the ecosystems and the peoples within those. And to give you some examples, there was a paper called The Political Biogeography of Migratory Marine Predators, published by a colleague, Autumn Harrison, just 2 years ago. And you might recognize that figure from a previous slide. She quantified the proportion of time that these migratory predators spend in the high seas. And some of them spend up to 3/4 of the annual cycle in the high seas. So those tunas, those sharks that are so famous and charismatic in the California current, they spend a lot of time in the high seas where there are multiple fishing nations targeting them. This paper, which came out just this week by another colleague, Juliano Palacio, they determined, or they assessed, that North America as a region as the most economically interconnected region to the high seas. So meaning that given the species that come in and out of the US EEZ, the US perhaps has the most to lose if these fish stocks are not properly managed beyond national jurisdiction. And a final paper, which we published just this past year as well, with a couple case studies of migratory species of cultural importance to indigenous communities in the coastal ocean. We also have a couple examples relevant to North America, where species that are of, again, cultural or spiritual importance to those coastal peoples spend a vast amount of time in the high seas. So we're also at risk of losing cultural values or cultural ecosystem services if we do not do a good job at protecting biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So just to wrap up my presentation, if I were to finish with one final statement, it would be that in the top of the screen, which is the United States is ecologically, economically, and culturally connected to the high seas. US engagement in the BBNJ negotiations, as well as other multilateral governance bodies and processes, is crucial to protect US coastal ecosystems, communities, and interests. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to Cymie.
Thank you, Guillermo. That was wonderful. And as ever, I learned a lot from it. So there's one more negotiating session for the treaty, which hasn't yet been scheduled. So this is a time of important developments for the text. And I'll just give you an idea of a couple of the issues that are on the table. One is this very large issue that there are industry interests that would prefer to remain unregulated and that are pressuring the State Department in the US certainly, and in other governments, to keep fishing, submarine cables and pipelines, seabed mining, and shipping out of the treaty. The US delegation, a second issue is for the environmental impact assessments. The US delegation understands very well the value of environmental assessment. The US law, the National Environmental Policy Act, was the first in the world to do this, and this has now become an international requirement according to the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And yet, despite that, and despite the fact that the US has been championing championing the EIA provisions in the treaty negotiation, the US has taken the position that only activities in the high seas should be required to do an international environmental assessment report, which is a very restrictive position. US policy is actually that activities under US jurisdiction and control, wherever they take place, should be subject to environmental impact assessment requirements. So for example, if a country planned to discharge a pollutant from land that was in sufficient quantities that it would affect ocean zones of other countries or of the high seas, that proposal should be subject to the environmental assessment requirements that we hope the BB&J treaty will include. So there are a number of issues like this. We don't have time to go into all of them. The US position is clearly going to be contingent on the results of the election, but it doesn't really matter about the politics. The United States will be affected, irrespective of political views, because this is physical reality. So that's going to affect us for our lifetimes and far beyond. The US has generally taken supportive position on treaties to protect ocean resources. And remember that this is intended to be an implementing agreement to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It might be worth taking a quick revisit to the US position on that. We are not a party to that treaty, although all other important maritime states are. Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and the agencies of the US government, including the Navy, supported US ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. President Bush actually urged the Senate to consent to ratification of the convention, and the reason he gave were national security, economic benefit, and to promote US interest in the environmental health of the oceans. And I think we ought to remember that normatively, we've been speaking in a somewhat utilitarian fashion about this, but the US cares, the people of the US care very much about the health and the creatures themselves. When we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about actual living beings. And there's a public concern for that, simply for their own sake. This will also, participation in a strong and robust treaty will give the US a seat at the table when the rights that are vital to our interest are debated and interpreted. And that is quoting George Bush in his remarks to the Senate. On that occasion, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman, Joseph Biden, expressed his support for ratification of the convention. So this is an excellent time to become engaged in this issue. We thank you for your attention and we look forward to your questions. And so we're back in your hands, Randy.
Thank you very much, Cymie and Guillermo, for excellent presentations. Certainly inspired a lot of questions from me. So I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment. Trying to prime the pump a little bit. So let me start with my let's get all on the same page starter question, which is, why isn't this treaty just called high seas instead of that mouthful, areas beyond national jurisdiction?
I think that sounds like a question for me.
Yes.
So, you could say it's the UN, but alternatively, a better answer is one, and I know there's a couple of people who are listening who will be chuckling at this because you know that this is a hobby horse of mine. It should be areas beyond national jurisdiction, or AB&J, the acronym, because that's a kind of negative description. It's saying we know we have legally defined what is within national jurisdiction, but there are many areas that are not specifically defined. For instance, the airspace above the water column in the ocean beyond national jurisdiction. That surface, the interface between the atmosphere and the water, is an extremely important zone. And if you talked about just the high seas, you might have a problem. The high seas are not defined under the Law of the Sea Convention or elsewhere. So how you would treat this area, the Newstan, the life that exists there, the interaction, the physical interactions, all of that is confused and poorly defined. It would be better to protect everything, since this is all legal concepts. We want to get everything under somebody's jurisdiction so that there will be responsibility. And so it would be better to say everything that's not currently under someone's jurisdiction, we're covering it now. So that's why A, B, and J is a better term.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So that I think is a great starting point for this discussion. And then in Guillermo's talk, when I'm not an ecologist, so I was very helpfully educated from many points in Guillermo's talk, but it reminded me that he was emphasizing this idea of protection of fisheries and how this agreement, this treaty is going to be important for that. And that prompted me to think, is there something about this treaty that's adding additional protections, for instance, for fish habitat, that go above and beyond what the agreement on highly migratory and straddling stocks already does?
Well, I think that's a really, really good question. How will this treaty impact existing sectoral activities in the high seas, such as shipping, fishing in the future? Hopefully not, but very likely deep sea mining. And it's a point of contention. It has been since the very start of the negotiations. Parties agreed that this instrument should not undermine existing bodies, essentially, including those regional fisheries management organizations that I was talking about. This international legally binding instrument is designed to be able to designate new marine protected areas in the high seas, which, as you probably know, are cross-sectoral management sort of instruments or tools. In theory, those should affect all activities within that space. Now, I'm not sure. RFMOs have been largely absent from the negotiations. Many, and we've also heard many nations say that fish under the agreement should not be considered as part of biodiversity, that anything related to fisheries and fisheries impact should be off the table. And so right now we are sort of in a limbo with regards to how this treaty will impact, from my point of view, the most detrimental activities on biodiversity, which is fishing. Commercial fisheries are the driver of biodiversity loss in the open ocean. Together with climate change, those are the top two stressors. And I am not convinced that this treaty, I don't think that it quite yet, maybe hopefully it will change, but I don't think that it has the necessary teeth to let RFMOs know that no, this area is delicate. It's home to endangered species, and it should be off for commercial fisheries. I've got colleagues in that side of the equation, on commercial fisheries side of the equation, and the BBNJ treaty, the first B in their lingo doesn't stand for biodiversity. Let's just leave it there. They think this is a joke, and hopefully we'll be able to engage more meaningfully with these other stakeholders.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful answer. The next point, bringing things very painfully close to the present day. I put a comment, and another attendee kind of echoed it and went a slightly different direction. And so my comment, or question rather, was, assuming we have a Biden administration, are you optimistic about progress on U.S. engagement on global ocean governance matters? And the related point from another attendee was expressing concern about the role of the U.S. On these issues once the new administration is confirmed, presumably either candidate, I'm not sure.
Shall I start and then you comment also, Guillermo, because I think you'll have some experience with this. It's true that the U.S. hasn't joined the Law of the Sea Convention. it has joined the fish stocks agreement that deals with the highly migratory and straddling stock species that Guillermo described. So I have every expectation that the US will play a positive role if we have a government that actually believes in multilateralism and international engagement and science.
So yeah, despite not being a U.S. citizen, I have spent almost a decade in the U.S. and so I've gotten to understand that the U.S. is one of those maritime nations that tries to do things properly. It is one of the most responsible high seas fishing nations. It's enacted so many pieces of policy and legislation like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens that are true examples to how you should be stewards of the ocean. So I hope that a new administration, whoever they may be, ratifies the law of the sea and becomes more engaged, because it is in the primary interest of the United States to become engaged, given the interconnectedness of the ocean. But I am curious personally why other administrations, Republican, Democrat alike, have not been able to push it forward. And I'm curious if it's maybe a question back to both you, Randy and Cymie, like, is it up to the Congress, the Senate, or the White House, or a combination of those three to move this forward?
I think that's what we've seen with ocean governance and climate change, that it's not just about the White House. It's we've had severe dysfunction in Congress for a very long time that's only gotten worse. So I think that's certainly a big problem, and that's why I'm frankly very pessimistic about any promising new progress on global ocean governance matters, regardless of who's elected, to be honest, because if the control of Congress remains as it is, I don't foresee much change at all.
And it's actually specifically the Senate. So the US Constitution requires that for a treaty to be ratified, that the Senate has to give 2/3 of the Senate, a supermajority of senators have to approve. Now it's 2/3 of senators present. So if they all have COVID-19, if they can't show up, then you could maybe get a vote in without actually having 66 senators. But because of that supermajority requirement and the political balance in the Senate, and concerns specifically about two issues in the Law of the Sea Convention that made that the treaty that has been consistently blocked. One is mandatory dispute settlement, and the other is the provisions on deep seabed mining. So, which should, well, we'll leave it there, but that is actually the reason. There was a very small number of conservative senators who were able to use this mechanism to block ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. But if there were a supermajority of senators who were willing to ratify, we could go ahead, willing to consent, we could go ahead with ratification.
Okay, the questions are coming in now. So the High Seas Treaty will require a complex relationship across different regimes. Does this treaty set them standards, whether in relation to EIAs or ABMTS?
That's a trick question. That is one of the questions in the negotiation. How will that be handled? Exactly what is the status of those provisions? For instance, it could be that each country has to do an environmental impact assessment, but it chooses what the methodology will be and how it'll go about it, and it'll have total control. Or it's under discussion whether that will be internationalized and centralized and somehow done through an international body associated with the treaty, and perhaps according to an international standard. My own view is that there's been a lot of experience and success in for instance, within the United States. I'll speak about that since I'm most familiar with that, where we have federal and state environmental assessment requirements, and you meet the most stringent requirement in a single exercise. You don't do multiple documents, but you coordinate that. It's a little complicated, but it's not impossible. And I think that's entirely feasible here, where the treaty could set an international standard, which is starting to happen through decisions by the international courts in any case.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And here's one more specifically, I think, for Guillermo. Are certain nations pushing for or against inclusion of fisheries management in the treaty? Appreciated Guillermo's clear statement on this issue.
Definitely. I think it is more obvious that there are nations who are pushing against any type of treaty that regulates the distribution and intensity of fishing in the open ocean. I mean, I don't want to call out any one nation, but highly developed nations with, or not necessarily high seas fishing nations, and there are many papers out there listing those nations. They have no interest in adding layers of regulations to high seas fishing activities, and I don't think the RFMOs, those regional fisheries management organizations, they don't want this BBNJ treaty to sit above them, definitely not. But I do think that these organizations are overwhelmed. I don't think they have the resources or the staff to address the wide range of ecological impacts of commercial fisheries. We recently published a paper with Christina Jerde, who's also here on the line today, and a couple others looking at the proportion of high seas fish stocks that are currently being assessed, and it is less than 5%. We have no meaningful information on most of the non-target species that are being impacted. So this new treaty could complement the mandates of RFMOs and the Fish Stocks Agreement and help these bodies meet their commitments and provide more holistic understanding of how humans are impacting the ocean. And by them sort of turning the backs, most of them turning the backs on this treaty, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot, because they could be, the BBNJ treaty could be their best ally for many of these objectives.
A lot of this reminds me of climate change. Is there any kind of effort to bring together climate and ocean more deliberately, because the challenges and the challenges with regulation and the threats of not regulating are so similar?
Do you want to respond first, Guillermo? I can tell you about that.
Sorry, I missed that last bit. Could you repeat, please?
I was asking if there's any kind of growing effort to focus on climate and ocean as connected challenges, because the regulatory issues involved in each of these and the impacts the potential for increasing impacts from failure to regulate effectively are common.
I'll give it a shot and then pass it back on to Cymie. I think that climate change has just entered the stage in the context of the BBNJ negotiations. It hadn't been discussed in the first few rounds, informal rounds of the preparatory committee. In the last round of negotiations, climate change did make it to several statements by various delegations. So hopefully it will take a more central role, but I'm not sure that the text is there. I don't know that those sort of statements have been translated into text. The international community is paying much more attention in recent years to climate change in the ocean. I think that latest IPCC report dedicated a whole issue or a report on oceans and the cryosphere. So we are now realizing that it is the oceans that regulate global climate, and that we should pay attention to what happened to ocean health if we care about climate change.
And within the treaty, so there are a couple of ways that it's being addressed. One is remembering that the focus of the treaty is on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. In the environmental impact assessment process, it is been proposed that climate change be explicitly referenced in talking about cumulative impacts that have to be taken into consideration when an activity is proposed. So someone proposes to do something in the high seas, an environmental assessment of the activity is done. They have to consider the context of current and future climate change impacts on the ocean. And here we really should say greenhouse gas pollution, because we're talking about acidification as well, not just temperature. Another way it would come up is within the area-based management tools, that there would be a consideration of whether there were special impacts. One of the values of the area-based management tools is that we have very few ways to offset climate change impacts on the ocean. There's very few adaptive approaches. And setting aside areas where we reduce other impacts may be a strategy, at least for some species, that can be helpful. Going back to the environmental assessment process, looking at the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions of a project would be part of the environmental assessment. So that could be helpful. But I want to actually take the chance to ask Guillermo to talk a little bit about the dynamic issue in relation to ABMTs, and this particular issue in relation to climate change impacts on the ocean.
ABMTs, just as a reminder, they're area-based management tools, and they're one of the 4 elements of the package deal for the treaty. And essentially, I'm not sure that the current text, again, in the context of ABMTs, talks about spatial management measures adapting to a changing climate, but that could be one of our best tools to respond to a redistribution of biodiversity in the ocean. And I see here that Malin Pinsky is on the call today, and he's one of the leading experts on this topic of redistribution of biodiversity, both longitudinally and latitudinally in the ocean, because of changing climatic conditions. So if those closures, whether they're MPAs or fisheries closures, can follow biodiversity as it is readapting to its new environment, that would mean that the BBNJ treaty was capable of pretty much putting into text the next generation of ocean conservation and management tools that are climate smart. But I'm not sure we're there. We are working, putting together policy briefs and manuscripts to support this idea of dynamic management. And that can happen across a whole range of temporal scales. So anything from annual closures that change from year to year to things like climate change that take many years to change the chemistry of the ocean. And so those closures might just slowly migrate over time.
We have about 5 minutes left. There's 2 questions. I want to start with this one. Can the treaty be designed to respect and work with the regional fishery management organizations?
Yes, it can. That would require RFMO showing up. And there have been, I think I've counted up to 3 out of 17 in the room. So if RFMOs engage with the treaty, we could definitely figure out ways to figure out these new institutional arrangements. Absolutely, and again, like I said earlier, I think it would benefit RFMOs to engage with the BBNJ treaty and this new instrument, because it will help generate a lot of the knowledge that they need to fulfill their mandates.
I'm not sure who exactly is in the audience, because I don't recognize all the names, but if anybody who's here is associated with RFMOs and can help work on this norm shifting so that RFMOs see this as the kind of opportunity that Guillermo's describing and help foster a more productive attitude. I think there's also cultural issues about, I don't know, do they talk about fish huggers or something, sort of an equivalent to tree huggers? Like, you know, when I started working at the US Department of the Interior, I was told by my supervisor that there were 2 kinds of people who worked at the department. There were the tree huggers and bunny squeezers, and there was the hook and bullet crowd. And I do feel like we have that kind of social norm problem, as well as simple concern about real rational interests being protected. And maybe Bonnie McKay can actually help advise us about that, as this is her expertise.
And this is the one question we haven't gotten to yet. Is there widespread support for areas beyond national jurisdiction, in quotes? Does it greatly expand the scope and number of interested parties and stakeholders, or adding to the challenges of negotiation?
It hasn't been discussed. The except privately, really, and there has been, yeah, I think there's a concern that it's disruptive at this stage in the treaty process. The problem is that in the definitions section of the text, there is a definition of A, B, and J that's very limiting. And it doesn't include some of these areas that I talked about, like the marine atmosphere, or the interface between the water column and the air. So I think it's relatively easy if one just took the definition out, it would cause no harm in the treaty text, and then the regime could evolve naturally to address these concerns. It doesn't need to be immediately involving a lot of regulation of airspace and things like that. But yeah, I think it's I appreciate the question being asked, because it reflects real thinking about what this means. So I think it's something we need to deal with.
Guillermo, anything to add to that?
No, I think Cymie covered it pretty well. I mean, the only thing I would say is that in terms of who is partaking in the negotiations, I think that many coastal and island nations, also landlocked nations, they have the same rights and freedoms in the high seas as anyone else. They don't realize just how connected the high seas are to their coastal economies. And just because they're not high seas fishing nations or high seas shipping nations, or well, shipping nations that use the high seas, they don't think it's relevant to them. And this is just my personal opinion, but just second to the Paris Accord, I think this is the most important treaty or set of negotiations that is happening in a decade or two easily. And it affects literally the living creatures and ecosystems in half of our planet. So the fact that some nations are not, and other stakeholder groups are not completely engaged is a little worrisome, but hopefully we can keep sharing the science and demonstrating that those same whales and those same turtles and tunas that you care about when you go and use the ocean, those may be coming from Taiwan or Chile or Spain. So we do have to engage in multilateral processes, and not doing it would be at our own peril.
That's a great point to close on. Finished right on time and had a really engaging discussion. Thank you so much, Cymie and Guillermo, for your very helpful insights on these very important issues.